Good afternoon. The first item of business is a statement by Alex Neil on Audit Scotland report management of patients on NHS waiting lists. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of the statement. There should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. Members who wish to ask a question could press the request to speak button now, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary. Mr Neil, you've got 10 minutes.
Officer, I welcome the opportunity to make a statement to Parliament on the report prepared by the Auditor-General for Scotland on the management of patients on NHS waiting lists. Firstly, I welcome the findings and accept the recommendations of the Audit Scotland report, and particularly the fact that no examples were found after extensive investigation of any deliberate manipulation of waiting list records. The Audit Scotland report is entirely consistent with and accords with the findings of the 15 internal audits reported to Parliament by myself on the 20th of December, and where they also found no examples of deliberate manipulation. I would remind Parliament that this is the largest investigation into the management practices of waiting times ever carried out in NHS Scotland. Between both sets of audits, over 500,000 transactions relating to periods of unavailability were scrutinised as part of the audit, and 400 staff were interviewed as part of that process. Consistent with the internal audit review last year, Audit Scotland commissioned consultants to extract extensive data from NHS board systems and provide a breakdown of that data, which was then analysed in detail to identify any unusual patterns and practices. This was used to select samples which Audit Scotland used to carry out more targeted investigation of individual patient records. I would now like to refer to some of the detailed findings of the report. Audit Scotland make a comment that systems for managing waiting list information had inadequate controls, and there were a number of different systems in operation in Scotland. We accept that systems needed to be modernised and that information contained within these systems has to be timely and accurate and serve patient needs. Audit Scotland also makes several references to the rise in social unavailability since 2008 and then the fall in 2011-12. There is a very simple explanation for this, Presiding Officer. The new wage system was introduced on the 1st of January 2008 by this Government to scrap the previously discredited hidden waiting list system, where patients could be left without a guarantee for many years. When we took office, 30,000 patients languished forgotten and with no hope of quick treatment on these hidden waiting lists. Audit Scotland recognised this in their 2010 audit, where they welcomed the introduction of this new system as being more open and transparent, and which was fairer to patients, and where the NHS had done well to implement the changes. Since 2008, boards have been gradually switching over to this new system, hence the rise in the recorded periods of social unavailability. I would hope that members would recognise that this was a system which was designed to be helpful for patients. It gave patients some degree of choice and control over when they should come to hospital and choose a time and a date which is convenient for them. One of the by-products of the significant reduction in waiting times is that some patients may need to delay routine attendances at hospital to accommodate their own personal preferences and social circumstances. Audit Scotland also recognised that social unavailability started to reduce in most boards in late 2011. This was partly a consequence of NHS Lothian switching how they recorded their patients. The reduction reflects the previous Cabinet Secretary's instruction to NHS Lothian to immediately remove patients from the unavailability list and put them back on the treatment list. Boards quality assuring their lists as part of the data migration to new systems, as well as additional capacity being increased by boards locally, for example in NHS Greater Glasgow, were other reasons for the reduction in social unavailability levels. We should also recognise that in 2011-12, boards were preparing for the introduction of the new treatment time guarantee. The report identifies that there had not been enough scrutiny of the reasons for increasing numbers of patients with periods of unavailability by the Scottish Government and by the boards. As part of the legislation in relation to the 12 weeks inpatient and day case legal treatment time guarantee, there is a requirement that periods of unavailability must be recorded and monitored. Legislation covers inpatient and day cases, and we have made clear that this information also applies to outpatients. Waiting times have fallen dramatically over the last 6 years, and through our patient surveys, we have the highest level of satisfaction in the United Kingdom and the highest levels ever recorded in Scotland, with 88% of patients being satisfied or very satisfied with their waiting time position. We need to ensure that patients' individual needs are met and that information is clear and consistent and readily understandable. This continues to be a high priority for the National Health Service in Scotland, and that is why I am pleased to announce today that I am introducing a patient advice line to make sure that if patients need help and support about their waiting time rights, they will get it. Presiding Officer, there is one additional point of clarification I would like to make to the Chamber on the findings of the Audit Scotland report, and that's in relation to Tayside. NHS Tayside have now completed their detailed internal investigation into allegations of manipulation of waiting lists. And I am pleased to advise the Chamber that the outcome of that investigation was, and I quote from NHS Tayside, quote, that there was no evidence presented throughout the investigation to substantiate this allegation. No evidence found that managers sought to deliberately manipulate waiting times, nor any evidence that they sought to bully or coerce members of staff to inappropriately code waiting times data. Audit Scotland have acknowledged the outcome of this investigation in the report. Presiding Officer, in my previous statement to Parliament on waiting lists, I advised that we would follow up swiftly all the internal audit recommendations. This will also apply to the 9 recommendations from the Auditor-General. I am pleased to say that, as of today, over 91% of the recommendations from the internal audits and many of the recommendations from Audit Scotland have in fact already been implemented. There are a small number of actions that have an implementation period beyond March. The extended timescale reflects the complexity of some of the recommendations, for example, upgrading and introducing new IT systems, in some cases requiring recontracting. We are continuing to hold Chief Executives and Chairs of NHS Scotland to account for that timetable, and I say again that boards will undertake a follow-up audit on the management of waiting times within the next 16 months to ensure that the planned improvements have been requested, that they have been made, and that these are working effectively. I therefore hope that this will finally put to rest some opposition members' accusations that NHS staff are involved in widespread and dishonest deliberate manipulation of patients' records. I stand by the integrity and basic honesty of our 155,000 staff, and I expect the Chamber to support that position.
Jackie Bailey.
Presiding Officer, let me start by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for an advance copy of his statement. However, it is really surprising that, as a nationalist, Alex Neil is relying on the Little Britain defence of "computer says no." Audit Scotland's report into the management of waiting times is a wake-up call for the Scottish Government. Not my words, but the words of the RCN. The systems are inadequate and have been open to manipulation. Not my words, but the words of the BMA. In short, the SNP have been accused of putting targets before patient care. What has been exposed by Audit Scotland is 1 in 3 patients parked on hidden waiting lists, their waiting time guarantees suspended, some without an end date to that suspension. Social unavailability reaches a high point in July 2011. Then NHS Lothian was rumbled, and suddenly the numbers fall across Scotland. And this isn't about patients being treated faster, because at the same time, waiting times are going up. 1 in 4 patients had their waiting time guarantee breached. Yet, miraculously, only 3% were reported to the Scottish Government. We can therefore have no confidence in the reporting and monitoring systems, as the Cabinet Secretary himself conceded this morning on radio. So when the SNP crowed about having the lowest waiting times, isn't it true that none of those figures were actually real or based on fact? And Audit Scotland presiding officer warned the SNP in their report in 2010 that there was a problem with social unavailability. So Nicola Sturgeon knew in 2010, the SNP knew in 2010, and they chose to turn a blind eye to it and do nothing about it. And please, Cabinet Secretary, stop using the staff as a human shield. This is about you putting spin ahead of patient care. And, presiding officer, isn't it the case that you can't trust the SNP with waiting times, and you certainly can't trust them with the NHS?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding officer, first of all, can I just say to Jackie Baillie, she's been quoted many times since this situation became public, that she's accused people all over Scotland and the National Health Service from fiddling figures a la Lothian. And can I say that even members of her own party privately say to me that they're embarrassed by the continual attacks on the integrity and honesty of the NHS staff in Scotland by Jackie Baillie. The second point I would like to make, presiding officer, is that under Jackie Baillie's previous administration, the total number of people on waiting lists in Scotland was 104,000. That is including the 35,000 on the hidden waiting list. We have now got the number of people on the waiting list now in Scotland is down to 65,000, including those who were designated as socially and medically unavailable. That's a reduction in the waiting list of 40%, presiding officer, since Nicola Sturgeon became the Health Secretary. Now, Jackie Baillie accuses us of having hidden waiting lists. I would make 2 points in response to that. The first one is, how can it be hidden when it's public knowledge, published and updated on a regular basis on the ISD website, and therefore it is open to everybody? And if everybody else was so unsmart, why was Jackie Baillie not so smart that she didn't find out that there was a problem when she looked at the website? And secondly, unlike under the previous administration, the 35,000 in their hidden waiting list lost their guarantee. Nobody has lost their guarantee to treatment under our list. Now, she has been quoting all day today the figure of 23% as some kind of attack on the numbers in relation to unavailability. Can I first of all point out, presiding officer, 1/3 of those people were medically unavailable. They told us they were medically unavailable. And therefore, to try to make hay with that kind of figure, I think, is not only dishonest, but extremely worrying for an opposition party. And the final point I would make, presiding officer, and again, this information is in the public domain, so Jackie Baillie can go and check it out. But if you look at the figures for the quarter Q2 in 2011, the quarter ending in June, which is the relevant period in relation to what we're discussing today, if you include the people with unavailability, include them, 94.3% of patients under this government, under Nicola Sturgeon, met their 18-week guaranteed time. And if you exclude the unavailability, the figure was 97.3%. Can I say, presiding officer, at no time, during the 8 years from 1999 to 2007, did the Labour Liberal administration get anywhere near that kind of performance?
Jackson Canlaw, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, presiding officer, and can I also thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance copy of his statement. Now, while no less concerned, Scottish Conservatives have attempted to steer an even course. I have no interest in perpetuating a debate between this government or its predecessor as to who did what best. We are concerned for patients. We've had 2 sets of report, the internal ones and the one from Audit Scotland, and at the very least I think they have created an anxiety and a confusion in the public mind. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary this? Is there a case for some health boards to answer? Is he confident he can now assure the public that they can have confidence in the system going forward? And given that he suggested in response to the internal audits that he would consider repeating the exercise after 18 months, will he today, in the light of the information we have, give a more express commitment to do so, and perhaps one which agrees to commission a further internal audit earlier than that, perhaps after 12 months?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, can I first of all thank Jackson Carlaw for the tone of his question, which I think is much more reasonable and realistic than the tone we have had from the Labour Party. Secondly, can I say to Jackson Carlaw that his suggestion of doing that audit quicker within a 12-month period is a very good suggestion, and I am happy to accept that suggestion. And that partly, hopefully, will answer the third part of his questions, which was the first question he asked about public confidence in the system. Over 70% of the population in Scotland now are living in health board areas covered by track care or an enhanced version of track care, which is a very robust system and indeed has been recognised as such by Audit Scotland. By the end of this year, over 90% of the population will be covered by that system. So I am very confident, once we've got all of those systems in place, that we can have absolutely total confidence on the integrity and the robustness of the data collection in every health board in Scotland.
Bob Doris, followed by Richard Simpson.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary believe there is a need for a clearer recording of reasons for social unavailability, given that it is reported that 900 orthopaedic patients at Glasgow's Western Infirmary were deemed socially unavailable? However, for some this was because they'd opted to wait for the preferred hospital and consultant. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm preferred hospital consultant are not part of the waiting times guarantee, but the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde did not remove those patients from the waiting list, and they were still being seen by the preferred hospital by their preferred clinician in the hospital of their choice?
Cabinet Secretary.
The Presiding Officer, Bob Doris, is absolutely right in what he says. Can I point out, however, as a result of the reforms introduced last year by my predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon, from the 1st of October last year, we no longer have a category called social unavailability. It's simply patient unavailability. And if a patient advises the NHS board that for whatever reason they are unable to meet a certain date, then clearly that is not only fully recorded, but it's agreed with the patient, and the options open to the patient are then agreed with the explained to the patient and a way forward agreed. And to make sure there is no dubiety either now or in future about that, the system Track Care records all of that, the reasons why, but furthermore, the board is then required to send out a letter to the patient to confirm the conversation and to confirm the way forward in terms of the patient's care.
Richard Simpson, followed by Ailey MacLeod.
How does the Cabinet Secretary explain Exhibit 8 in the report, which shows a 9-fold variation in ophthalmology and a 5-fold variation in orthopaedics for social unavailability? Because we know these specialties are under the greatest pressure, and surprise, surprise, these are the ones where up to 50% of patients declared themselves unavailable in different boards. So aren't the boasts on waiting times that the SNP have been making actually based on a fiction, as is made completely clear by Exhibit 9 in the Audit Scotland report? Really, what SNP credibility is left with regard to the system as it's operated until this point?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, can I first of all say that as far as Audit Scotland was concerned, when we introduced the new system, both in 2010 and 2011, and I'll quote from Audit Scotland, in 2010, in relation to managing NHS waiting lists, a review of new arrangements, Audit Scotland said, and obviously you will accept this as gospel because your whole argument is based on Audit Scotland, we found that the NHS has done well to implement the new arrangements and people no longer remain on waiting lists indefinitely. And in 2011, another report headed Measuring NHS Waiting Lists 12-month Summary Impact Report on the new system. Let me quote exactly what Audit Scotland said, not me, not my predecessor. This is what Audit Scotland said. This audit provided assurance that the new arrangements are generally working well. The Scottish Government has developed further guidance about the areas where we raise concerns, such as the treatment of patients who do not or cannot attend their appointments. ISD Scotland is continuing to work with NHS boards to improve the quality of new ways data. There should not be any need to conduct a follow-up study in the foreseeable future. So Audit Scotland had full faith in the new system, and clearly the result of that has been that the kind of allegations inferred by the Labour Party are nonsensical. Having reviewed 500,000 files, having reviewed over 250,000 transactions, having interviewed 400 staff, although Audit Scotland didn't bring itself to say so, they found no evidence of Lothian-style fiddling. And for the Labour Party to try to infer there is totally unacceptable.
If I am to get all members in who want to be called, we really do need shorter questions and shorter answers. Aileen MacLeod, followed by Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. One clear aspect that has come out from the Audit Scotland report is that the patient administration IT infrastructure was not robust enough at the time that the actual audit was carried out. For example, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde had 11 different IT systems. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what progress has been made in upgrading the IT system to meet the standards required?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, very substantial progress. As I said, 70% of the population is now covered by Track Care or an enhanced version of Track Care, and by the end of this year, over 90% of the population will be covered by that system. In relation to Glasgow, I think it's very important to point out, Aileen MacLeod is absolutely right. We inherited 11 different systems. There's now 3 systems, and it's going down to 1 system, Track Care. But actually, even although the old systems we inherited from the previous administration weren't robust enough for interrogation by Audit Scotland to get the answers to the questions they wanted, when they did a manual check, they found that there was no manipulation and no concern in terms of the robustness of the information. And I think we should bear that in mind, that the manual check proved that there had been no Lothian-style fiddling in Glasgow.
Drew Smith, followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. 70% of all orthopaedic patients at the Western Infirmary were marked as socially unavailable at the beginning of 2011. 900 real people with painful conditions waited for treatment in Glasgow. Some of them might even have been Nicola Sturgeon's own constituents. Doesn't the Cabinet Secretary realise that it is not credible, and he is making a fool of himself to pretend that Glaswegians were somehow twice as likely to be on holiday as the rest of the country in January and February 2011? Will he now, on behalf of Nicola Sturgeon, apologise to the thousands of patients across Glasgow who may have waited longer than they needed to?
Cabinet Secretary.
Not only am I not going to apologise, I'm very proud of the fact that we have got an 88% satisfaction rate on waiting times by patients in NHS Scotland. Had there been any major problem with waiting times and waiting lists, then the surgery of Nicola Sturgeon, my surgery and everybody else's surgery would have been absolutely full of people complaining about the time they had to wait. The reality is, quite frankly, if the Labour Party had anything like half the 88% satisfaction rating the NHS has had, they would have made a decent opposition.
Jim Eadie, followed by Jim Hughes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Given that there have been 2 robust and thorough investigations initiated by the Government into NHS Lothian, can the Cabinet Secretary provide an update on what steps have now been taken to implement the changes at NHS Lothian so that patients in Lothian will never again be denied treatment because of the manipulation of waiting times and unacceptable management culture?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, a very comprehensive programme has been implemented by the newly appointed Chief Executive Tim Davison in NHS Lothian, and we already see a very substantial improvement in waiting times and the number of people waiting for various procedures in NHS Lothian. I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the tremendous work that Tim Davison has undertaken since his appointment as Chief Executive of NHS Lothian, and NHS Lothian, I think, very soon will be back to its rightful position in these terms as one of the best performing health boards in Scotland.
Jim Hume, followed by Colin Beattie.
The Minister again has asserted that this was not widespread across Scotland, but the Audit Scotland report clearly states, and I quote, the Minister likes to quote from Audit Scotland, the trends in NHS Lothian were similar to the rest of Scotland, unquote. Will he finally accept this was not the fault of inadequate IT systems, but down to capacity issues in certain specialities and clinics across all boards, and will he take this opportunity to apologise to the hard-working NHS staff who were forced to amend patient records to achieve his government's targets without the necessary tools to do so?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I hope that Jim Hume is never called to do jury duty, because if you look at the evidence, nobody is guilty outside of Lothian of manipulation or any other kind of fiddling of the waiting list in the NHS Scotland. And the reality is, instead of trying to manufacture suspicions and innuendo against NHS staff, can you not now accept that this historic situation, because the period covered by the Auditor's report ended in December 2011, that we've accepted the lack of sufficient robustness in the IT systems? We're putting that to right. We've dealt with, my predecessor dealt very effectively when the problems at NHS Lothian were uncovered, and the result now is we have very, very robust systems indeed. I think it would be fair to say we now probably have some of the most robust IT systems operating in most of our health board areas in Scotland in the whole of the UK.
Colin Beattie, followed by Ian Gray.
Is the Cabinet Secretary able to indicate what policies will be brought into place to ensure NHS boards will share good practice on enhancing performance reporting to monitor patients on waiting lists?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely. That's part of the implementation of the recommendations, both from the original audits and indeed in terms of our interpretation of how to implement the recommendations from Audit Scotland. I have also, Presiding Officer, requested a monthly report from every one of the 15 boards who are involved in this exercise in terms of the progress in implementing the recommendations. And as I've already said earlier in reply to Jackson Carlaw, I will be carrying out and commissioning a comprehensive evaluation after about 12 months to ensure that the system is working, the new systems are all working properly throughout the National Health Service in Scotland.
Ian Gray, followed by Gil Patterson.
Whatever Audit Scotland said in 2010, what they say today is there was not enough scrutiny of how NHS boards were applying waiting list codes. Available information should have highlighted potential concerns for the Scottish Government and NHS boards to investigate further. This information included evidence of increasing rates of social unavailability, reported use of social unavailability for patient choice and retrospective changes to waiting list data. Not enough scrutiny. Is the truth not that for 3 or 4 years Scottish ministers simply turned a blind eye to the evidence in order to make claims on waiting times which they knew to be inaccurate?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, every health board in Scotland is audited every year. Half of them are actually audited by Audit Scotland. Not one audit brought to our attention any of these problems. The reason you employ an auditor, the reason why you employ an auditor is to audit the systems as well as the books. So the reality is they are pretty hysterical this afternoon, Presiding Officer, because they can't get a story out of this. They can't find a story.
Can we just get the answer?
The reality is, Presiding Officer, all the normal auditing procedures were carried out, and the minute this came to light, my predecessor acted decisively and swiftly.
Gil Patterson, followed by Margaret MacDonald.
Cabinet Secretary, I think most people would agree that a whistleblower's hotline would be an important thing to have, so it would give the public confidence in this issue. Can the Cabinet Secretary say what further steps have been taken to introduce a whistleblowing system and when that's likely to happen?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I've already announced that from the 1st of April I'll be introducing a whistleblowing system throughout the NHS in Scotland, and I hope to announce the details of that very shortly.
Margaret MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if I could ask the Cabinet Secretary to strike out on a new road. And remember, it's patients we're talking about. Patients who get flu and who fall over and trip and can't keep appointments. Doctors who get caught up in traffic accidents and so on. I think that we're allowing ourselves to be driven by targets that are unattainable, and everybody's getting far too neurotic about it.
I think there was a question, Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say two things? First of all, actually, we've achieved the targets and exceeded the targets, but nevertheless, the underlying point, I think, made by my friend Margaret MacDonald, is that we should never forget this is about patients. And that's why we've set the targets, because under the previous administration, the waiting time was 6 months. We've reduced that to 12 weeks. I think patients actually benefit enormously from that huge reduction in waiting times.
That ends the statement from the Cabinet Secretary on the Audit Scotland report. We now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 5596 in the name of Murdo Fraser on the report on the achievability of the Scottish Government's renewable energy targets. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I'll give a few moments for members and ministers to change their desks. I now call on Murdo Fraser to speak to move the motion on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I just remind members time is a bit tight?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In January 2012, the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee agreed its approach to a short, focused inquiry on the achievability of the Scottish Government's renewable energy targets. Then, after 11 months of taking evidence, we published our report in November 2012. Now, some may infer that this timescale indicates poor convenership on my behalf. However, it actually reflects the seriousness and rigour which the Economy Committee members, some of whom are applauding that last remark from me, applied in examining the Scottish Government's ambitious targets for the development of renewable energy technologies by 2020. Before I comment on the substance of the Committee's report, I would like to place on record my thanks to all those who gave evidence to the Committee, whether written, in person in front of the Committee or during visits. The Committee is grateful for their time and contributions, which have helped shape the conclusions and recommendations within our report. I would also like to thank my fellow committee members for their patience and support throughout the lengthy process. We did have a number of changes of personnel throughout the period, and I am aware that it was a particular challenge for those members who were asked to approve the report when they had not directly heard the evidence. I would also like to thank our very competent team of clerks who supported us efficiently and with good humour, particularly Joanna Hardy, who had the difficult job of drafting the report. Thanks to Spice, particularly Alistair Reid, and to the Parliamentary Media Office for handling so well the arrangements for Donald Trump's appearance before the committee. Whatever our views on his contribution, that was a good day for the Parliament. Now, in a 13-minute speech, Presiding Officer, I cannot do justice to all of the areas which the committee scrutinised and commented on, but I will instead focus on those areas which I think are the key to achieving the Government's ambitious targets. It is worth making the point here that this was not a report into the desirability of the targets, but into their achievability. Had it been the former, then it might have been even harder to get a consensus around some of the report's conclusions. Members will be aware that I have my own views on certain aspects of renewable energy policy, particularly the expansion of onshore wind, which, in my usual understated, shrinking violet fashion, I will on occasion air publicly. But in this debate, I am speaking as convener of the committee, so I will leave it to others, for today at least, to make those arguments if they wish. As the committee learned during its inquiry, the renewable energy sector is a rapidly evolving policy area. Both during the committee's consideration of its draft report and after its publication, there have been a number of policy announcements at a Scottish and UK level, and I will endeavour to include comment on these where relevant. First, the big question: are the Scottish Government's targets achievable? Well, in relation to the target of generating the equivalent of 100% of electricity consumption by 2020, yes, the committee agreed that, on balance, the evidence we heard is that the target is achievable, but, crucially, only if a number of issues are addressed, and I will say more on some of these issues later. What about the target for renewable sources to provide the equivalent of 11% of Scotland's heat demand by 2020? Well, that is a more mixed result. We recognise that the interim target had been met, but given the evidence the committee received, there is a risk that the 2020 target may not be met. And finally, in relation to the target set for local and community ownership of 500 megawatts electricity by 2020, well, we have doubts regarding the level at which the target is set, and we have recommended that separate targets for local and community ownership be established. Now, returning to those issues which need to be addressed if the 2020 target of achieving 100% equivalent electricity consumption is to be achieved, one of the most challenging issues is planning. As we learned, uncertainty, time delay and complexity within the current planning regime increases the levels of risk and therefore expense for developers, and this in turn could place the Scottish Government's targets in jeopardy. We also heard from many objectors, particularly those who were opposed to inappropriately cited wind turbines, as to their concern at the way the current system works. Now, members will be aware from the media there are an increasing number of renewable energy applications being submitted to local authorities for determination. The distribution of these applications across local authorities is resulting in some councils experiencing very high volumes of applications. And this, combined with the pace at which renewable energy technology is evolving, can leave councils facing the significant challenge of balancing national priorities with local interests. The committee heard that the pressure had become so great that some councils, such as Aberdeenshire and Fife, had called for a temporary moratorium on onshore wind farm applications to allow their planning teams to cope with the volume of work. One potential remedy to this squeeze on resources, which the committee considered, was the introduction of higher planning fees to enable an expansion in staff numbers. As members are aware, this was the subject of a recent Scottish Government announcement that, subject to parliamentary approval, in April planning fees will be increased by 20%. The committee supports this. Yes, indeed, I'll give way.
Rob Gibson.
Very much. Having been involved in the previous discussion about renewable energy, it was reported in 2009 that the councils were under-resourced with planners. Did the committee look at why planning committees had been cut, planners had been cut further in the time between now and then?
Andrew Fraser.
I don't recall that was an issue. We specifically addressed while giving evidence. I really have to go back and check exactly what the witnesses said to us. I suspect it is a symptom of the broader squeeze on local authority budgets, but perhaps I could come back to the member later if I get the opportunity. The committee supported the proposed government fee increase for the larger scale planning applications, where these won't disadvantage community developers. But we were clear that in return for higher fees, planning authorities should look to address duplication of effort for developers and improve efficiency. And one example of removing duplication of effort we highlighted was for planning authorities to gather information on cumulative visual impact from their own records, rather than each developer having to undertake this task separately. We welcome the Minister's confirmation that the Government, along with COSLA, will be looking at proposals to link performance with the wider reform of planning fees, and that the Scottish Government is working with stakeholders to identify and pilot good practice on a proportionate approach to the provision of information to support planning applications. However, it would be helpful if the Minister could confirm when this pilot will be completed and evaluated by. I'd like to mention the issue of environmental impact assessments, which are required in relation to those planning proposals which are likely to have a significant impact on the environment by virtue of factors such as size, nature and location. As the committee learned, planning authorities are tending to err on the side of caution and request them for medium to small-scale projects, as they are aware that the absence of an environmental statement is open to challenge by objectors. And we therefore recommended that the Scottish Government should clarify to local authorities those circumstances under which it is acceptable not to provide an environmental statement. In its response, the Government explained that these requirements derive from European directives and that the European Commission is currently reviewing these. We would welcome information as to how the Government is engaging in that review, and also how the Government is working with local authorities to ensure that they are not being overly cautious in interpreting the circumstances when an environmental statement is required. One source of frustration for planning authorities was where some developers ignored spatial plans and put in speculative applications to councils for determination. Spatial plans identify the areas appropriate for siting turbines and provide clarity for developers and local residents on the preferred areas for development contained within the plan. We were extremely disappointed by the progress being made by local authorities in producing spatial plans. In its response, COSLA explained that a short-life working group on onshore consents has been formed during the committee's inquiry, and it would look to take forward some of these matters. Whilst the committee welcomes this consideration, we do remain concerned at the speed of progress in providing spatial plans, which are crucial to informing both developers and the public what they might expect in relation to renewable developments in their area. And in our report, we also urge developers to play their part in reducing planning authorities' workload by paying due cognizance to the local spatial framework and areas of search where these are available. Throughout the inquiry, the committee heard a strong message from potential investors that strong political leadership and a robust, reliable and predictable investment climate and subsidy regime are crucial if the government's targets are to be met. There is now a range of funding available to support the development of renewables, such as through the Renewable Energy Investment Fund, the Green Investment Bank and the Community and Renewable Energy Scheme. However, the committee heard that small and medium-scale projects face distinctive difficulties in attracting lending from banks, with the withdrawal of some banks from the market segment supported by the feed-in tariffs, which tend to be the smaller developments. Now, given that small-scale installations have a valuable contribution to make towards achieving the government's targets, and also are more affordable for farmers, landowners or community groups, it is important they are able to access lending. So we regret the reluctance of banks to lend in this sector, and we welcome the commitment of the Renewable Energy Investment Fund to support community and rural business projects, and we would welcome an indication from the Minister of any projects that will be financed by this fund. Let me touch briefly, if I can, on the question of infrastructure. In addition to the question of transmission and distribution, an issue which arose was the ability of the grid to reach areas where renewable energy resources are most abundant. Infrastructure, or the lack of it, also impacts on Scotland's capacity to export spare energy. Scottish islands such as Orkney best illustrate this issue. Orkney's connection to the mainland is now at full capacity, but there is no project big enough to provide the critical mass which would provide a return for investment on a new cable. Whilst we heard from some witnesses that there was a strong case for transmission network operators going ahead and increasing capacity in advance of increased demand, Ofgem's duty is to ensure that investment does not place in advance of need, in order to protect the consumer from the cost of an asset that is not used. Now, whilst we welcome Ofgem's announcement in April last year that it would fast-track the business plans of Scottish transmission network operators to hasten upgrades to capacity and greater interconnection, we remain concerned that Ofgem is not taking a proactive approach to grid development. And we will also watch with interest the outcome of the Scottish Island Renewable Generation Steering Group set up by the UK Government in October 2012 to advise on the barriers to faster connection of Scottish Island renewables. The committee was also strongly supportive of grid-connected test facilities, such as the European Marine Energy Centre in Orkney and the proposed European Offshore Wind Development Centre at Aberdeen Bay. We were fortunate enough to see for ourselves the test centre and the impressive array of other renewable facilities in Orkney and the Pentland Firth. Test facilities are critical to Scotland, being at the forefront of newer technologies, proving the case for investment and helping to drive down costs. Finally, Presiding Officer, I would like to close by commenting on one of the most contentious issues relating to renewable energy, its potential impact on tourism and Scotland's rural and remote areas. I do not doubt the strength of feeling on these issues. However, at the time of reporting, the committee had received no robust empirical evidence indicating a substantial negative impact. However, given the importance of the issue, it is vital that Visit Scotland and the Scottish Government continue to gather and take account of evidence from visitors to Scotland and in other research in this area, and we welcome the Government's commitment to do so. Since the time we concluded our evidence-taking, I am aware of at least one more study in this area being published, that from the John Muir Trust, and I am sure that there will be more. Presiding Officer, can I say in closing that this inquiry into the achievability of the Scottish Government's renewable energy targets may not have ended up being short and focused, but I hope it was very valuable nonetheless. I hope that our recommendations will be helpful to the Government in developing future policy and will also be a useful contribution to the ongoing and very lively debate about the development of renewable energy in Scotland. And with that, I move motion S4M 5596 in my name on behalf of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee.
I now call on Fergus Ewing. Minister, you've got 9 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to begin by thanking the committee, its members and the clerks for their report and for the huge amount of work that went into producing it. The report is presented in a balanced fashion and makes both a positive and a constructive contribution to the debate about Scotland's energy future. Its publication coincided with our update to the Scottish Government's renewables route map. Both publications underline the welcome degree, Presiding Officer, of broad consensus in this chamber about the importance of renewable energy and about energy policy as a whole. I warmly welcome the committee's central finding that our target to produce the equivalent of 100% of domestic electricity demand by 2020 can be achieved. Our renewable heat target, too, is of the utmost importance. Recent figures from the Energy Saving Trust show that renewable heat is on the increase across Scotland. However, we know that the monitoring progress is complex, and this is an area that we are working hard to improve. Meeting our renewable targets will clearly help reduce carbon emissions. Figures released this week show a 35% drop in emissions from our fossil fuel stations between 2006 and 2011, and this has coincided with huge growth in our renewable output. But the targets are also about jobs, and they are about investment, and they are about making the cost of energy to consumers more affordable by reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Renewables are also fundamentally a matter of energy security. This week, Alistair Buchanan, Ofgem's Chief Executive, warned us that the UK's electricity capacity margin could drop from 14% today to under 5% by 2015-16. Indeed, I think I'm right in saying that this repeated the same warning that was given to the UK Government last October. This could hardly be more serious. And sadly, that we have reached this pass, that there is only a margin of around 4 or 5% between the generation capacity and peak demand, can only be seen as a sad indictment of neglect of energy policy for far too many decades. Security supplies are of paramount importance. This is particularly true in the context of the developing UK Energy Bill and its incentives for new renewables and low-carbon thermal capacity. Put simply, Scotland's renewables output, especially offshore wind, can play a vital role in helping to keep the lights on across the UK, something to which I think we are all subscribed. Our renewable power will therefore play a vital role in the UK meeting its own binding renewables targets, as well as keeping the lights on. We also hear concerns about the timescales to build new gas capacity. Presiding Officer, clear and fast signals are necessary if those investments are to be made and become available when they are needed. And I think the warnings by Keith Anderson of Scottish Power should be given considerable weight by the UK Government in this respect. And this is important because lower carbon thermal generation will complement and help balance Scotland's renewable generation. Investment in this new low-carbon capacity creates major implications for the UK grid network. Beauly-Denny represents Scotland's first major grid investment in 20 years and the first of the major reinforcements that will deliver a transmission network fit for an energy mix rich in renewables. Ofgem is fast-tracking a £7,000 million investment programme by Scottish grid companies to upgrade our network and to deliver renewable electricity to the GP market and potentially beyond. Crucially, Ofgem recognises this cost to be both competitive and to represent value for money for consumers. These investments of billions of pounds have been driven strongly by increases in operational and planned onshore wind capacity.
This underlines, Presiding Officer, that onshore wind developments in the right places have and will continue to play a vital role in driving investment and creating a platform for the development of our offshore renewable potential. The recently formed intergovernmental group on island charging, formed at my behest and I'm very pleased to say agreed to by the UK Government working in partnership in this matter, will also play a crucial role in developing these resources, and I welcome the UK Government's acknowledgement of the impact of a charging structure that acts as a significant brake on development. This is extremely important work, as members such as Liam MacArthur is well aware. I'm determined to work with members across the Chamber in all parties to drive forward this so that we have a solution emerging from the intergovernmental group, and that, crucially, this solution emerges sooner rather than later. Otherwise, key projects may be placed at risk of being in jeopardy. Now, Murdo Fraser quite rightly highlighted the areas in planning, so perhaps I should turn to these now. I was encouraged by the report's reactions to the ways in which the planning system can help achieve our renewables targets, whilst recognising the improvements and actions that the Committee has suggested. The system is well set up to deliver large-scale onshore wind or to steer it away from sensitive locations, and my working group on onshore renewables wants to achieve continuous improvements in that respect. At the smaller scale, there are some tensions in the system which we have also addressed. As Murdo Fraser mentioned in his opening remarks on behalf of the Committee, our 20% increase in planning fees effective from April is intended to help improve planning performance. And we have also provided an extra £673,000 to help planning authorities process wind turbine applications. Presiding Officer, we plan to monitor this closely and to share good practice. Planning policy must continue to support the development of a diverse range of renewable energy technologies, guiding development to appropriate locations. And our review of the National Planning Framework and Scottish planning policy will reinforce and clarify policy on the areas we expect to be protected from significant development. Where Scottish Government is the decision taker either on Electricity Act consents or on planning appeals, we will only approve the right developments in the right places. Our decisions in these matters are available online, whilst data capture, which the Committee also highlighted, is improving all the time. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, our published response to the report covered these issues and the others highlighted by the Committee. I am sure that many of these will be raised during the course of the debate, and I look forward to responding towards the end of today's session.
Many thanks. Now call on Rhoda Grant. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I echo the thanks expressed to those who took part in the inquiry and indeed helped draw up the report. As was previously said, the committee inquiry was to examine whether the Scottish Government's 2020 target for renewable energy could be achieved. And indeed, this is a new and developing industry where weekly developments added to the complication of managing the inquiry, and it meant that many of the aspects pertinent to the industry were hardly touched upon. Take, for example, that of energy storage. We talked about pumped hydro batteries and indeed have since been learning about hydrogen. All of those issues are something that I hope we can examine further in the future, but weren't really gone into in any depths in this report. One of my main concerns at the outset of the inquiry still remains, and that's the ability of communities to develop their own renewables for the benefit of those who live locally. Community benefit clauses appear to be the answer, but the committee heard evidence that showed that where communities had a real stake in the development, they were much more likely to have an influence on it. And they were also able to retain much more of the wealth created in their own area. And that was greatly increased the bigger the share the community had in the development, with outright ownership being very much the best option. Yet communities struggle to develop due to costs and the red tape involved. We need a different criteria for planning processes for communities to cut costs of development, and we also need to ensure that there is adequate funding available for them to develop, and that was touched on by Murdo Fraser. There was much agreement in the committee. However, there was an aspect we couldn't agree with, and that was the constitutional impact, the question of constitutional change and how that impacted on the 2020 targets. There are real concerns that the Scottish Government must answer, and if they do not, development will stall, and this will impact on the ability to meet those targets. However, these are questions that the Scottish Government refuses to answer and have used their majority on the committee to remove them from the report.
Mike Mackenzie.
Don't you agree that despite some witnesses expressing that view, all the evidence that we see coming forward is that companies continue to invest in renewable energy in Scotland, and that those sceptical about any uncertainty due to constitutional change are really just scaremongering with a political agenda?
Rhoda Grant.
Companies that work in Scotland, such as SSE, can't be seen as political scaremongers and need to be listened to. And it's very disappointing that the Government used its majority in the committee to close down the questioning on this aspect. However, those questions don't go away, and the question that remains unanswered is, what will the Scottish Government do to honour the subsidy agreements entered into under ROCs or contracts for a difference, should Scotland separate from the United Kingdom? And in order to ensure that development is not stalled, the Scottish Government need to give this commitment. They need to tell us how they're going to pay for these subsidies. Currently, they are met by the UK energy customer. In Scotland, we proudly boast of having a third of the UK's renewable developments. However, we only have 10% of the customer base. And if the subsidy falls on that customer base, this will mean substantial increases in energy prices on energy bills. The committee also looked at renewable heat and heard a number of concerns, and some of those appeared to conflict with each other. Were the targets ambitious enough, and indeed were they too ambitious and unlikely to be met? And while renewable generation for electricity was reasonably easy to distribute, there is no easy way to distribute renewable heat. We'd heard evidence of district heating systems that worked well. However, they only worked in certain locations and appeared only economic if they were connected with new builds rather than existing properties due to the cost of retrofit. It was also clear that there was a number of solutions that would need to be required, not least demand management through retrofitting insulation and improving building standards for new builds. If we are to meet our carbon emissions target, we need to focus on renewable heat.
Paragraph 7 in the summary says a factor in the difficulties with renewable heat has been the UK Government's delay in agreeing the domestic renewable heat incentive. Does she not accept, therefore, that constitutional change offers benefits to achieving these targets that should not be dismissed?
I don't share the members' confidence that this government would be any better than the UK in bringing forward that. Indeed, they need to bring forward retrofit for insulation to cut down demand, as well as the renewable heat incentive. But I do agree that is something we need at some speed. Can I turn quickly to the grid, which was mentioned before, and the Minister in his opening statement talked about the work of the Intergovernmental Island Charging Group. It would be very useful to get an update from the Minister as to what progress is being made by this group, and indeed what timescale they hope to report. Because if we can't find a solution to island charging, an awful lot of the projects, especially community projects that are online, will stall, and we will no longer be able to pull them forward with the economic benefit that will bring to communities. Presiding Officer, I realise I'm running out of time. I wanted to touch on skill shortages and what the Government needs to do to ensure that we reap the full benefit of renewables, but I can see that you're indicating to me that I can't. Therefore, I would only urge the Government to look at the report on those issues and act accordingly.
Many thanks. We are short of time today, as Rhoda Grant has already indicated, so let's scan on the 6 minutes, up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by declaring my usual interest, given that my son is a project manager for wind farms, currently working in Aberdeenshire. I do welcome the tone of this debate so far. But the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee are to be commended for the production of this excellent report, which thoroughly addresses the achievability of the Scottish Government's renewable energy targets. But on reading the report, I do hope that the committee will find time to revisit this report in this session of Parliament, given that the government response, understandably, to many of the recommendations are that they are considering issues, they are committed to progress, they plan to work with stakeholders, along with noting the committee's remarks on biomass. So I would hope that the committee report and the government's response is the start of a journey and not the end of it. There are many aspects to this report, as Rhoda Grant has just said, that are worthy of debate, but I will just stick to 3 issues. And the first one is probably the effect of wind farms on tourism. The committee rightly recommends that Visit Scotland and the Scottish Government continue to gather evidence on this from visitors to Scotland. But I would also hope that they listen to the views of the Mountaineering Council for Scotland, who state that they're not opposed to renewables. They simply recognise that our wild lands and open spaces are fundamental to Scotland's character and identity, and many parts of the region I represent form the last great wilderness in Europe, and they should be recognised and valued, not at all, certainly not from you, sorry, should be recognised and valued in this year of Natural Scotland. The John Muir Trust also confirmed that 80% of respondents to their survey consider that some areas need protection from wind turbines, yet Visit Scotland claimed that 40% of their responses say it doesn't matter. So given that we have these claims and indeed counter-claims, there's no doubt that there is need for thorough and accurate research. And I would also say it's not just the visitors to Scotland that should be taken into account in determining or justifying wind farms, but all of us who live in Scotland, and particularly for those of us that live in remote and rural areas and hugely value the wild land and scenery around us. I do appreciate that many studies were done some years ago, but there are no, I will not, and certainly not, no. And there are now 10 times the number of turbines in Scotland than there were in 2004. And my second point is on the intermittency of supply. And this is a critical issue, yet the Government notes the committee's views. I would have liked, and I know that Fergus Ewing does have a very good reputation of working in partnership with the United Kingdom Government, and I hope in summing up that you will give a commitment to working to further research and adoption of storage technology, which, as Rhoda Grant mentioned, will ensure far greater utilisation of our existing resource, particularly of wind turbines. And it would increase production of the existing wind farms, and this would undoubtedly be a positive approach. I think, as the Minister said, we should be concerned at the warnings of Ofgem, and I won't repeat what he said on that, but I would agree. Conservatives, of course, would support the new third and fourth generation nuclear power stations with their improved efficiency and safety standards. And I would remind members that we would need around 5,200 onshore wind turbines to generate the same output as one nuclear power station, which would last for 60 to certainly not Mr Brodie. No, and if I have to keep repeating myself, I'll take 20 minutes for this speech. Right, we need 5,200 onshore wind turbines to generate the same electricity as one nuclear power station, which would last 60 to 100 years, as opposed to the 25-year lifespan for wind turbines. My third point is on planning, which often, as not, leads to the heated debate. A claim I hear more often than any other is the lack of local democracy. Local residents can engage with their councillors and the planning committee can determine an application, but if it is refused, the developer gets a second chance, with the Scottish Government quite often overturning the decision made by elected councillors. There's also concerns over Section 36 applications, and I was disappointed that this area only received one mention in the committee report at paragraph 55. If councillors are acceptable arbitrators on applications with an output of less than 50 megawatts, why are they simply consultees for applications for over 50 megawatts. And I would hope that in the review of planning that the Minister would look at this requirement, which I understand was based on the 1989 Electricity Act. But now that planning is devolved to the Scottish Government, and this requirement was brought in at a time when it referred to large power stations that were being built and not local wind farms. So I hope that the Minister will look at that again. And just finally, Presiding Officer, a lack of consistency in the visualisations that are submitted with planning. I saw the Daviot application, and the height of the wind farms was about twice the size in the information given to the Council as locally, and I'd like you to look at buffer zones.
Many thanks. We now move to open debate, and I call on Mike Mackenzie to be followed by Margaret McDougall. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to firstly commend my colleagues on the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee for their extensive work on this important inquiry. And I would like also to commend our team of clerks and advisers for their patience and their professionalism, and thank the many witnesses who gave evidence to us. The result is, I think, a comprehensive and valuable report on what is a subject of the utmost importance to Scotland. Presiding Officer, this is a big and it's a complex subject, and our inquiry was necessarily a long one. And in such a fast-moving field, much has happened since we finished taking evidence. And I'm pleased that most of this has been positive. I particularly welcome the First Minister's announcement of an even more challenging but achievable interim target for generating 50% of our electricity by 2015. Political will is the vital ingredient in assuring our success in achieving these targets, and fortunately we have that in abundance. And renewable energy is important not only because we enjoy such significant opportunities and economic advantages from these technologies, but because of all the commodities in the modern world, energy is the king. With sufficient low-cost energy, we can quite literally solve all of our other problems. And this, along with our oil and gas reserves, gives Scotland a huge comparative advantage that really makes it difficult to see how we're not set for a future of long-term and sustainable economic success. And of course there are challenges in achieving these targets. If there weren't, we wouldn't have set the targets high enough. But the committee has painstakingly explored these challenges, and the overwhelming conclusion is that the challenges are surmountable and that we're on course to achieving these targets. And of course, just as there are challenges, so there are many opportunities for jobs and growth, as well as for local social benefits, including the means in many areas to tackle the scourge of fuel poverty, because it's an absolute disgrace that an energy-rich Scotland should suffer fuel poverty to the extent that it does. And I'm glad to note that since the report was published, the difficulties we indicated with the planning system have at least partially been dealt with the Planning Minister recently announcing a 20% increase in fees and providing a fund that colleagues have referred to of £673,000 to help deal with wind turbine applications. I'm also glad that the committee has been successful in exploding some of the myths surrounding renewable energy. The myth that onshore wind destroys tourism was thoroughly explored, and no evidence of this was found. The myth that wind power doesn't reduce carbon intensity, blown away in the breeze, confirmed by no less an authority than National Grid themselves. The myth that wind intermittency presents a problem and negates carbon savings, revealed also as nonsense by National Grid and others. The myth that consumers are paying very high premiums to subsidise renewables, now known to be of the order of £21 per annum, a tiny fraction of annual fuel bills, a tiny fraction of annual fuel bills. The committee made its view quite clear in paragraph 196 of the report, saying it is the committee's view, therefore, that renewable energy represents a safe bet both for energy security and for protection from price shock. Presiding Officer, I particularly welcome the target of 500 megawatts for community renewables, which offers the possibility of transformational change across the Highlands and Islands and elsewhere. And when I look at what the Shetlanders have done, I thought Tavish was here, but he's not. When I look at what the Shetlanders have done with their oil fund, where a very small levy on the oil passing through their community has provided community facilities that are second to none, I see a model for what can be done across the rest of Scotland. And when I think of the difficulties faced by Scotland's islanders, struggling for generations in the teeth of a hostile climate, and the opportunities now offered by these exciting technologies, I am filled with great hope. And this hope is increased when I see the world-leading research done at EMEC on Orkney, with young Arcadians returning to Orkney to take up the exciting and cutting-edge career opportunities now available. And considering the challenges in achieving our targets and the full potential of our renewable opportunity, one group of problem, Presiding Officer, looms larger than the others. These are the problems that are entirely within the province of the UK Government. Damaging and disproportionate transmission charges for Scotland's islands. A failure to invest enough or early enough in upgrading the grid. Delay and uncertainty in energy policy, manifested now in a delay in setting strike prices for contracts for differences. Inordinate delay in introducing the domestic RHI, the Renewable Heat Incentive, and a Green Deal, which is not the right deal for the right people. The list is a long one, and once again, the UK Government have made the case, quite eloquently, that these decisions are best taken here in Scotland with this Parliament.
Thank you very much. I now call on Margaret McDougall to be followed by Marco Biaggi.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was not a member of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee when the inquiry and subsequent report on the achievability of the Scottish Government's renewable energy targets was produced, but I look forward to participating in this debate today. It struck me while reading the report that, though ambitious, Scotland's renewable energy targets are achievable, but there are numerous issues that need to be addressed, because there is little point in setting ambitious targets and then not taking the steps required to realise them. If these targets are to be met, we need to make sure we have the proper courses in place to deliver people with the right skill sets. Worryingly, while reading through the report, a lot of the evidence seemed to suggest that we are falling short on this. While I recognise the Government is working in partnership with the industry and educators, it seems something is being lost in translation. For example, in evidence given to the committee, Rob Moore from the National Skills Academy for Power states, "We have the potential to meet the targets, but it will take a lot of work. If we don't do this differently, we will not meet them." Linda Gregg from Carnegie College also said, "We will not meet the targets because we are not taking into account that people are leaving and the fact that we have a workforce that is skewed over the age of 35. And Robin McLaren from the Institution of Engineering expressed concerns over the availability of skills and the fact that we were operating within a global market. So it seems that something is going wrong in our ability to attract young people, particularly young women, into the sector. I agree with the committee in saying that we need to work with colleges, sector skills councils and employers to equip people with the right skills and deliver hands-on, intensive, accelerated training schemes. However, I fear that this might not be achievable due to colleges already being overstretched and having their budget slashed once again. The other point I wish to raise is on community engagement. Interaction with the communities and developers generally comes from onshore wind farm developments in rural areas. In North Ayrshire, we currently have 3 sites operating according to the Register of Community Benefits from renewables, and they have all supported local groups, local schools and the larger community through community benefit payments. However, I hear that in some cases these sums of money come with conditions attached. For example, if a local group receives funding That group then has to make an agreed amount of appearances a year on behalf of the site. In other words, promote the wind farm. What is more worrying, as noted in some of the written evidence submissions, is that these benefits seem to undermine the planning process and they are used to build favour by the developers. In North Ayrshire, we saw exactly that happen recently when a community wind farm submitted a planning application to extend its site. The wind farm has been made contributions to 2 primary schools in Dalry, and they are grateful for that. However, the children's school bags were used to deliver what was in fact a draft letter in support of the wind farm planning application, fully prepared and even addressed to the North Ayrshire planning officer. All the parent had to do was sign it and send it off. The Council have said it was at the head teacher's discretion to distribute these letters, and the schools have justified it as being part of an eco-course and a getting involved in your community project that the children were doing. Does the Minister agree with me that it is inappropriate that children are used in this way, under the guise of environmental education? Not to mention the conflict of interest for the school as part of the local authority that will decide on the planning application. I am supportive of community benefits in principle, and as the committee reports, that they can stabilise fragile communities, provide and promote energy efficiency, thereby reducing the cost of energy bills and help to promote renewable energy developments, which in turn will help us achieve our targets. But we need to make sure that these benefits are not then used as a form of bribe to get local support for planning applications. As the committee report says, community engagement should be a two-way street and developers should have to adopt a code of practice. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we need better connectivity with the industry and educational bodies to provide the right skilled courses to attract more young people, particularly women, into the sector. While I certainly don't want to see community benefit removed, it does seem to create problems with the planning process, so we need more clarity on this. And I ask the Minister to develop robust new guidelines so that incidents like the example I used in North Ayrshire don't happen again. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Conor Marco Biaggi, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And following on from Mary Scanlon, I draw attention to the declaration made in the report. In the terms of reference, the very first question set out in this inquiry was, are the 2020 renewables targets for electricity and heat achievable? And the answer quite clearly was yes. Progress on renewable electricity has raced ahead, further and faster, I think, than anybody could have hoped or imagined. It's very easy to be cynical about politics in today's world. You could even say it's fashionable. But this progress does give permission to everybody who is ambitious and believes that politics and political decision-making can actually change things, that we can move forward and do better than the mistakes of the past, whether that's in energy or any other field of endeavour. I remember knocking doors in the election 2 years ago, and even though how energy is generated is a bit far off from most people's lives, time and time again I saw that spark of inspiration in people's eyes when they realised that their government had this sort of vision. And now, after some careful and, I have to say, arduous drafting, the EET committee reached, perhaps consensus is too strong a word, a common position on almost everything in the report. That too is refreshing and would be welcomed by the public, who, after all, always are saying that we should work together and overcome our differences rather than arguing all the time. But politics is about differences, and if we all agreed on everything, we wouldn't need a parliament. So to keep things interesting, I'll perhaps dwell on a couple of the divisions. In particular, since I was one of the members that Murdo Fraser referred to, who wasn't present during the evidence, I really do have to draw more on the experience of the drafting. And it's fair to say the committee mirrored the difference of opinion that exists between the Scottish Parliament and the United Kingdom Government on nuclear in particular. We've already heard that here. Contracts for difference are the UK's price support mechanism that is being introduced. Everyone recognises that they are the new UK Government subsidy mechanism for renewables as well. Yet nuclear power is also eligible, and therefore, ipso facto, they are also a subsidy for nuclear, which is one of the things that was contentious to state in the report. While there are silos for the different energy types, nuclear draws from the same limited pot of money as renewables. Although a lot depends on strike price and implementation, I'm personally just uncomfortable that they're sitting at the same table. My approach with nuclear would probably be to take it and lock it in a cupboard with a padlock and throw away the key. But this is an aspect of UK energy market reform that really does have implications for Scotland, and which the committee rightly opposed, although only by majority. I don't think any energy source with greenwash should hide behind greenwash and hoover up subsidy that is intended to support green, genuinely green energy, and that goes for Scotland as much as anywhere else. But that takes me to paragraph 185, which Rhoda Grant has already alluded to. This states, quote, "The support the Scottish Government can provide to the development of the renewable sector is limited by the current constitutional arrangements," unquote. Now, this is factually true, as Schedule 5, Part 2D of the Scotland Act remains in effect. And I can only assume that the 3 members who voted against it did so not because it was false, but because it was an inconvenient truth. And if Rhoda Grant would like to challenge that, I give way.
Rhoda Grant.
I just correct the member. Actually, the paragraph that I was referring to is in Annex C, the paragraph that was voted down by the Government Party that read, "The committee believes there are significant issues regarding the subsidy regime in light of the constitutional debate that required to be addressed, and calls on ministers to continue to update the committee on those matters." That was the paragraph I was concerned about.
Marco Biaggi.
Said the one you were alluding to, the one you were referring to, I note that the replacement paragraph was actually proposed by Patrick Harvey, a man who is not a member of the government and who I would actually believe would put green energy in front of independence at any opportunity. And to get back to where I was going, I think in Scotland we've achieved a great deal, and I very much welcome the Minister's constructive tone. But as we were going through drafting the report, I kept on seeing issues where instead of being able to act, we really only had the power to ask nicely. We maybe have a bit more peace now, having broken out in transmission charging and the fossil fuel levy, but we still have challenges in contracts for difference, Crown estate, funding demand reduction, accessing private finance, perhaps most of all. WWF have asked us to increase the renewable heat target, but would this be a target with very limited levers, since RHI is a reserved issue? And going on to something related at the moment of particular interest is RPP2. A great deal of importance is attached to CCS, and it may well be a necessary counterpart to providing the base load needed for the 100% target. But I would be delighted if the Minister could perhaps provide some reassurance and some information in his own contribution on how we can attempt to lever that in here in the Scottish Parliament with the powers that we have. I don't think a policy of a 2014 yes vote is really sufficient in that, much as I would be overjoyed. And looking ahead, Murdo Fraser wanted to separate desirability and achievability. Those two are very, very connected. And I think that rather than endanger the confidence that has been shown with uncertainty fostered by an unsupportive UK government who really doesn't have a strong commitment to renewable energy, there should be no barriers to our ambition. The sky is the limit.
Many thanks. Now call on Liam MacArthur to be followed by Roderick Campbell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I congratulate the rigorous Murdo Fraser and his committee colleagues on the report that, as Marco Biaggi has indicated, was not always smooth in its gestation. Can I thank members for taking the time to come to my constituency, the home not just of marine renewables, but I think of community renewables as well. And can I welcome the unanimous support for the targets, which are ambitious, are also achievable. And I think it's important that the political steer is a clear one, both about our commitment to decarbonise our economy, but also in creating a genuine renewables powerhouse in this country. I think the committee is right to set out a number of challenges for both Scotland's government and others in ensuring that that happens. I think it's regrettable that there are areas of division along party lines, and some of those have been explored. I think there can be no dispute, however, that, as SSE have confirmed, the potential break-up of the UK is being factored in as a potential cost when assessing future investment. And it's not just SSE that are saying this. This is not a complaint with the Scottish Government. It's certainly not a complaint with the Minister, who I know is held in high regard. I'm not suggesting at all that investments are not being made, although it's interesting the nature of those and the time frame over which the decisions are being taken. But next to no one is arguing that the answer to the sector's prayers is independence, and there's an understandable reluctance for businesses to put their head above the parapet. They don't like uncertainty, whether that be financial, regulatory, political. They have enough on their plate as it is if we decarbonise our economy, including our transport system and heat, while keeping the lights on and bills manageable. The reform is therefore essential. I think the report is right to highlight concerns about the lack of detail at this stage in terms of electricity market reform, in terms of delays, in terms of domestic renewable heat incentive. I hear those concerns myself. I support the comments in the report and from WWF, the importance of heat, both in terms of half of demand, 47% of emissions and 60% of household energy costs. But I think it illustrates the paradox for Fergus Ewing, somebody for whom I have the utmost respect, who I've worked with very collaboratively over a number of years now, and who I think adopts very much a collaborative approach. But the better the deal that is struck on electricity market reform, on transmission charging, on whatever, the more there is to lose the separation. That is the paradox that he is faced with. The report, though, makes some helpful... No, I think we've heard enough of your views, Mr Mackenzie. The report makes some very helpful recommendations across a range of issues in skills, workforce development, supply chain and community development. I agree that separate targets for community and locally owned development is needed. Orkney has excellent examples of both, but they perform different functions. They are seen very differently. But I wish to focus on a couple of areas. I'll turn in a minute to the grid issue, but let me start with transmission charging, an issue that we debated in the Chamber shortly before Christmas. At that stage, I indicated that locational charging is now anathema to achieving our objectives. It's discriminated, it's hampering future investment and distorting decisions about where to locate. Scottish Renewables report Swimming Against the Tide highlights the cost comparisons in terms of grid charges and the dramatic effect that charging island-based developers for local works, including undersea cabling, will have. This disparity, up to 120% by 2020, potentially undermines the ability of our islands, including Orkney, to fulfil their potential, in turn compromising Scotland and the UK's ability to deliver on its climate change and renewables targets. Given the global lead we currently enjoy in wave and tidal energy, this would be a scandalously wasted opportunity to create thousands of jobs, attract millions of pounds of investment and develop skills and expertise that allow us to build a sector internationally. But I think there's certainly one.
Mr Ferguson. I entirely agree with this analysis about the potentially damaging consequences if there is not a solution found for transmission charging for the islands. A point I raised with John Hayes last week when I met with him in London to emphasise this point. Would he agree with me that it would be extremely helpful if Mr Hayes or Mr Davey were to attend a meeting of the intergovernmental group as soon as the consultant's report is concluded, in order, once and for all, to find a solution to the island's transmission charging problem?
I certainly agree with you. We had a discussion on this, and I repeat what I said then privately, that I would fully support that and lend what support I can with colleagues at a UK level. I think the Renewable Steering Group has been strongly commended. It is making progress, and I think there are a couple of ideas for options for getting a solution to this. Either, on the one hand, enhanced ROCs for the islands to compensate for the additional burden of charging, which has the benefit of relative simplicity, or using Section 185 orders to reduce the charges around our islands, although there would be a need, obviously, to amend that given the 10-year time limit. So I think there is cause for optimism, but we must, as the Minister said, maintain momentum. The other area of concern is in relation to grid. It's something I highlighted last year. On the back of the concerns I raised there, the Minister was helpful in helping set up the steering group at an Orkney level with the subgroups established alongside it. Although since then we've had the announcement from Shettle that there's going to be a further 2-year delay in the laying of the 132 kV cable. This is hugely disappointing. The reasons for it I find difficult to accept in certain instances, and there's no doubt it's having an impact both on confidence but also potentially on reputation. This flows into having an impact on investment and, in the meantime, lost opportunities. So I think there's a need to reinforce and maintain the work of the steering committee that's been set up, and I hope and count on the Minister's support in that. There are many areas that I haven't had a chance to touch on, notably fuel poverty. Again, I would point to the work being done on tele-switching and using renewables to assist fuel-poor households in Orkney. The message from this report is that targets are achievable, much work is still to be done, and there's need to show our islands, including the ones I represent, play a full part. We have the skills, natural resources and appetite. We need now to have a more level playing field and an opportunity to be totally competitive. In return...
Thank you. Now Colin Roderick-Campbell to be followed by Ian Gray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome Murdo Fraser's and the committee's report. When the committee published its report back in November, it was reassuring to note its central finding, which was that the renewable energy target for electricity generation is achievable. Clearly, that's subject to caveats, but in an international context, it's not an exaggeration to say that Scotland is leading Europe and the world in terms of renewable energy and the wider transition to the green economy as emissions from energy production fall. Looking at the EU Energy Roadmap 2050 and the European Commission's targets of 20% by 2020, in Scotland we're talking of meeting or at least coming very close to achieving 50% in the next 2 years, let alone 100%. I therefore think it's high time that some members of this chamber refrained from describing the targets as ludicrous. It's important that we keep an eye on the prize, as Scotland, which is virtually self-sustaining in terms of energy generation and consumption, and redouble our efforts to achieve it. That includes supporting the development and deployment of renewable technologies in line with the EU Energy Roadmap and in order to meet our emissions targets from the Climate Change Act. Looking internationally, in Germany, the energy Wende, or transition to a sustainable energy generation and consumption, is well underway. In the League of Large European Nations, Germany is more than pulling its weight in the process, with over 25% of supply coming from renewable sources in the latest figures, compared to the UK's 9.4% and France's 20%. Despite this, Angela Merkel's CDU coalition has come under serious criticism for cutting back on subsidies for renewables too early, putting thousands of jobs at risk and potentially stalling Germany's impressive momentum. By the same token, however, Germany's decision to decommission all of its nuclear reactors by 2022, in recognition of the Fukushima disaster, has been warmly greeted by environmental organisations around the world. Aside from the enormous subsidies associated with building and running nuclear power stations and the astronomical costs of storing waste, the true cost to the state of disasters can be 5 times higher than the price the nuclear industry paid by way of insurance, as the Fukushima example showed. No, I don't think I've got enough time. But, of course, there are concerns about the siting of wind turbines. Local authorities have got to ensure that they fully assess the cumulative impact of plans before making a decision. They need to undertake a proper consultation process of residents and businesses, as well as taking into account the guidance of important agencies like SNH and Visit Scotland, amongst others. That was an important recommendation in the committee report. And, of course, we do need to balance carefully the interests of all in the planning process. And as the committee suggested, and as the government has accepted, we need to make progress in identifying spatial frameworks at a local level. But we do need to recognise, indeed, as Fergus Ewing has already stated, that the national policy in relation to wind turbine development is under review as part of the review of Scotland's planning policy. But we need to look at these things in context. We need to take a full view of subsidies in relation to wind farm development, and not to pursue calls for slashing in funding for the industry while failing to take into account the fact that contracts for difference, as proposed, represent a subsidy in relation to nuclear industries, a matter that was agreed, with one exception, I think, by the committee, let alone fail to take account of the substantial nuclear clean-up costs. It's unfortunate to say the least, and if we were to accept those arguments, we would seriously jeopardise the energy and emissions targets agreed by this Parliament. At the end of last year, I corresponded and met with a company based in North East Fife, which is promoting new and innovative designs of tidal energy. It's precisely these kind of sustainable industries we need to support into the future. We also need to recognise that the Scottish Government's Saltire Prize is clearly an extremely useful incentive for developers of wave and tidal energy sources in particular. Of course, the debate surrounding energy production and consumption shouldn't just be seen in terms of targets and government strategies. Individual households and businesses have a role to play in reducing demand by consuming less. That includes proactive measures such as installing more efficient heating systems, replacing boilers through the scrappage scheme, designing new homes and fitting existing homes with the highest levels of insulation to increase energy efficiency, making simple efforts around the home to use less energy and much more. As to heat targets, we should take heart from the fact that the interim target for renewable heat sources has been exceeded, and the discussion between the Scottish Government and the UK Government on the detail of the Renewable Heat Incentive Scheme to be launched this summer could clear the way for more progress towards the 11% target in 2020, which has hitherto been delayed by the UK Government's failure to act decisively on the matter, a fact mentioned already by Marco Biaggi, and a point also mentioned in the committee's report. But as the World Wildlife Fund indicate, however, heat accounts for more than half of the energy demand in Scotland, 47% of CO2 emissions and 60% of household energy costs. So perhaps we should consider being a little bit more adventurous than 11%. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, this is a very valuable report, which I'm pleased to note the Government has been taking seriously, and I welcome this debate today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Ian Gray to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. There is no doubt that Scotland's energy future is central to our economic prospects, to say nothing of crucial to the degree to which we can mitigate or reverse damage we do to our environment locally, nationally and globally. And in the long run, that does, I think, mean delivering a shift to renewable energy technologies. So the committee should indeed be congratulated on an important inquiry and the exhaustive range of evidence they took from witnesses, both erudite and sometimes colourful. But the central conclusion of the committee report, that the target of 100% equivalent energy consumption from renewables is achievable, hides more than it reveals. EDF's evidence, for example, said it might be technically feasible, but then goes on to say that it relies on subsidy levels, investment in transmission infrastructure, storage and a UK energy market, all uncertain. And the committee themselves identify skill shortages, delayed grid development, intermittency and the affordability of offshore wind as genuine risks to the target. They quite rightly drew attention to the risk to investment posed by uncertainty in transmission charging and electricity market reform. All the evidence was a plea for clarity, durability and stability in the support regime for renewables. But you cannot, as some colleagues have tried to do this afternoon, seriously argue that uncertainty over the details of EMR is damaging, but uncertainty over the potential future of EMR post-2014 does no damage whatsoever. That is simply not credible. In my own constituency of East Lothian,
Mike McKenzie.
You've mentioned that there's a single UK market, and we will be moving in the future, and the committee heard evidence with a North Sea interconnector to a European market, and that when those electrons are pushed down the wires, the consumers don't care what the country of origin was, and that when they pay for them at the eventual point of use,
briefly, Mr McKenzie,
the subsidy will be contained in that final price.
Ian Gray, I can give you your time back.
And in exactly the same way, the electricity consumers of England and Wales don't care where the electrons come from, and if they have alternatives to expensive subsidised renewable energy produced in Scotland which are cheaper, then they may well choose to get their electrons from there. That is exactly the uncertainty which is affecting investments at the moment. My own constituency of East Lothian has a key role in delivering these targets. It has significant installed wind capacity already, and it is close to offshore consented sites. But we need to look at what is happening on the ground. Take planning. The committee emphasised the need for local spatial plans to give a clear indication of where developments might be approved. And in East Lothian, we already have a carefully constructed local capacity framework for wind turbines. But in recent months, we've seen 4 single turbines deemed inappropriate by East Lothian Council simply railroaded through on appeal. In one case, the reporter explicitly says that the local spatial framework can and should be disregarded. Now, the Minister needs to understand that this contempt for local democratic decision-making for the sake of a relatively insignificant capacity is driving many of my constituents to oppose all wind generation and is undermining confidence in the planning system. In East Lothian, ministerial decisions are exactly driving wind turbines into sensitive and inappropriate areas. And yes, that was my constituents laughing when they heard the Minister's description of how he believes his planning system is operating. And that's not helped either by ministers imposing an unwanted energy from waste incinerator on my constituency too, and then expanding its consent so waste will be shipped in from all over Scotland. Locally, serious efforts are being made to use the opportunity of offshore developments to regenerate Dunbar Harbour, exactly as the committee suggests we should. But any funding for that so far has had to come from hard-pressed council resources, and the dangling of the same prize in front of many competing communities is fuelling uncertainty there too. Meanwhile, Kickenzie Power Station closes next month, removing 1,000 megawatts of capacity from the Scottish grid, with no sign yet of the already consented replacement gas station. The Minister acknowledged the importance of thermal baseload to back up renewables. He, as well as his UK counterparts, has a role to play in ensuring that this project is delivered in my constituency. Of course, East Lothian is still providing up to a quarter of our electricity in Scotland on any given day, with 0 carbon emissions, 500 high-quality jobs and apprentices and training for the next generation. But this is at Torness, unacknowledged, unsupported and unwanted by ministers and indeed the majority of the committee. My county has always provided more than its share of Scotland's energy, from coal mines to nuclear power to wind farms in the Lammermuirs. Our local problems now are not unique, and they reflect the weaknesses in national energy strategy. Planning issues, too narrow a focus on wind, an illogical and ideological opposition to nuclear, failure to develop the supply chain and grid infrastructure quickly enough, and above all, a failure to take the public with our energy strategy. That might yet be the biggest risk to the Government's 2020 targets. These risks are all to be found in the committee's report. I sincerely hope it is to them that the Minister and the Scottish Government respond, rather than the rather bland conclusion that the targets can be met.
Thank you. I now call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Alison Johnston.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. As one of the former members of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, and one who actually took part in the inquiry up to the signing off of the report, I'll actually focus on some of the general findings of the report, as well as looking at how the planning issues can impact on the Scottish Government's renewable energy targets. Certainly this report is the result of a lot of work, not just by the past committee members and also the present ones, but also by the Clarkin team, who provided some excellent support once again to the committee. And certainly I want to put on record that my appreciation and thanks to my former committee members of the time, and also to the Clarkin team for their efforts. I also want to thank everyone who did provide evidence to the committee. So, as we know, Presiding Officer, that Scotland has the potential to be a world leader in renewable energy, and it's in this context that we must look at the achievability of the ambitious targets set by the Scottish Government. Now, the committee's report is positive, highlighting that the targets are within our reach, even if we have some issues to iron out. Now, one of those issues that has been discussed already today is that of the planning system. Now, there was concern that the pressure on the planning system was in part due to the high number of renewable energy applications, and the Scottish Government has, however, taken measures to address this. There are some measures to address it, including the commitment to providing more funding to planning authorities. I welcome the idea within the report of potentially increasing planning fees charged for larger scale applications, as long as these will not disadvantage community developers. Now, this additional finance could be used to boost resources in individual planning departments where necessary. I also welcome the Scottish Government's announcement on the planning fees increase, as identified earlier on by Murdo Fraser and also by the Minister. I think that there should also be some greater clarity on the issue of environmental impact assessments. Now, the Scottish Government and local authorities, I would suggest that should come together to address this issue, providing greater standardisation and guidance on issues such as the visualisation standards and the noise assessments. I know that these are points that certainly were touched upon in the report. I support the benefits of the community-generated renewable energy, and would agree with the report that the Scottish Government should consider making adjustments to planning policy that would include clearer consideration of the local economic benefit of projects through the planning system. And certainly, just before I continue on the community aspect, there was one point that was touched upon yesterday in the Local Government and Regeneration Committee discussion regarding the RPP2, and that was the issue of energy being generated by local authorities. Certainly, we know that local authorities already do have the power to actually do this. They can do it if they wish. But also, there will be start-up costs that are going to be high. However, I know that certainly there will be some areas in the country that because of the post-industrialised areas that they are, some of the infrastructure may actually still be there that can be invested upon and then brought back into use. I'm thinking certainly in terms of some potential hydro schemes across the country. So, going back to the community element, I welcome the letter from the Minister for Energy, Enterprise and Tourism and also the Minister for Local Government and Planning to COSLA and the Heads of Planning Scotland, which sets out the Scottish Government's requirement that spatial frameworks will form part of the local development plans. There is a real concern about local authorities' rate of progress in producing spatial frameworks. The timely delivery of local spatial development plans agreed at local level in an open, transparent and democratic process, but with the due regard to national targets, can reduce the costly and inefficient disputes about renewable energy developments that take place all across Scotland. By providing the greater clarity on what type of developments are likely to be permitted and where in any local authority area, we can provide both the local citizen and the developer with more certainty in the planning process. Local authorities must ensure that local development plans are consistent with national objectives and targets. Finally, while recognising that each planning authority has its own plans and policies, there should be some consistency for developers with a broadly similar service, regardless of where their applications are made. And also, as we already know, the Scottish Government's planning policy is something that's under review at the moment, and certainly look forward to see what actually comes out of that at the end of the process. I want to touch upon a couple of points that were raised earlier on in the debate. Lee McCartney, also the member for Orkney. I was one of the members who actually went to Orkney, and I thought it was a fascinating trip to actually go on. I learned so much, and a few key things actually came out for me. Was one is that the people who are there, they actually appreciate the tremendous opportunity that they have, but also certainly for Scotland, the enthusiasm with which they're actually targeting and trying to really develop. The opportunity they have is just outstanding. And also, they're building up this expertise on a daily basis. And that's certainly something that will certainly help Orkney, but also all of Scotland. And just one other point regarding tourism. I tried to intervene on Mary Scanlon earlier on, but unsuccessfully. And that's the point regarding tourism. I'm not aware of tourism numbers in Orkney actually decreasing as a result of the wind turbines that actually are there at the present moment in Orkney. I'm conscious of time, Presiding Officer, but so just one other point is just that regarding I think we know this is an energy opportunity for Scotland, and it's one that we certainly must grab with both hands. The tough targets have been set, and that certainly helps steer a clear path forward for developers, for the communities, but also for the job opportunities for our younger people in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Alison Johnston to be followed by Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a vast subject dealt with in a long inquiry, and I too would like to thank the clerks for their work and the many witnesses who shared their expertise to help us scrutinise and shape policy on renewables, an incredibly important task. I'm pleased we have a chance to debate the report now, and I'm going to concentrate on two very important areas that don't always get the attention they deserve: the heat targets and community ownership of renewables, though several colleagues, including Rhoda Grant and Stuart Macmillan, have helped to address the deficit this afternoon. We know that heat accounts for roughly half of Scotland's energy use. We're currently delivering 3.8% of heat demand from renewable resources, with an estimated 5.6% in the pipeline, and the target is 11% by 2020. So this is promising progress, but as the convener has said, the evidence we heard during the inquiry suggests there's a risk we still won't reach 11%, because incentives have been delayed, development of the infrastructure required is still too rare, and there are serious concerns over biomass sustainability. These are challenges, but they're certainly not insurmountable. Aberdeen Heat and Power submitted written evidence to the inquiry that tells an inspirational story. This arm's-length, not-for-profit company was set up 10 years ago by Aberdeen City Council with the aim of providing clean, affordable energy. They now provide district heating to 1,500 homes and more than 10 public buildings. Heat and water charges have dropped 40 to 50%, fuel poverty has reduced markedly, damp has been eliminated, and they've created homes that people want to live in. They've seen carbon savings of up to 40%, and the heating method isn't even renewable, just a vastly more efficient way of organising how we deliver heat. So this story demonstrates the leadership role local authorities and other public sector bodies can play, as was stressed in the report's recommendations. The Government, as their response makes clear, agrees. Yes, certainly.
Kevin Stewart. Officer, I welcome Ms Johnson's mentioning of Aberdeen Combined Heat and Power, which does a fantastic job. But would she agree with me that other local authorities have got exactly the same opportunities as Aberdeen, should probably look at the situation there and probably ensure that that best practice is taken right across Scotland?
Alison Johnson. Certainly, and I'd like to think the Government will take every opportunity to provide leadership and ensure that they do so. Members will remember the Greens dedicated debating time last year to the role publicly owned renewable energy companies could play in delivering our climate targets and, importantly, extra revenue for public services. And after demonstrating its support in paragraph 266 of the report, I hope the Government will do all it can to revitalise and support the publicly owned energy company idea. We are seeing a renewables revolution in Scotland. It's exciting, and I'm really pleased, after listening to the evidence, that the committee was able to agree, by and large, a very positive report. The public favour renewables too, but there is scant support for a big company coming in, building turbines and keeping the vast amount of benefits for themselves and their shareholders. It simply doesn't feel fair, and there are far better models out there. An exciting community-driven project in my region is Balerno Village Trust's plans to build micro-hydro on the Pentlands Harlaw Reservoir. They have planning permission, they have SEPA licensing for the project. They're currently waiting for a lease from Edinburgh Council and grid connection before they can start raising capital. Their grant from Community Energy Scotland was essential in kick-starting this project, but more needs to be done to help smooth the process of grid connection. The Greener Leith and Pedal Portobello community groups in Edinburgh City worked hard together to secure energy share funding to push forward their plans for a community turbine on the coast. Unfortunately, there are issues with the site, but their commitment to the project highlights their belief in the many benefits that such an asset would bring the community. Kirknewton is another community in my region champing at the bit to get renewable energy projects off the ground. They're progressing numerous initiatives, but by an accident of geography, Edinburgh Airport's radar has frustrated attempts to build their own turbine. They are looking at alternatives. And these are just two communities who've come up against barriers to their renewable ambitions by an accident of geography. We need to tap in, develop and support community interest. Kirknewton's common sense suggestion is for a matchmaking scheme to help ensure the maximum amount of community benefit comes from renewable projects on the National Forest Estate. Up to 49% of any National Forest Estate renewables project is available to the communities who live nearby, if they can raise enough money to buy into the scheme. but raising the money isn't always possible, and in these cases Kirk Newton suggests that another community keen to develop renewables but unable to do so on their own land could be brought in to help, and this might be an ideal way for urban communities to participate too. So, I've talked about heat and the potential role publicly owned energy companies have in delivering heat networks and generating new revenue for public services. And I've talked about the desire of communities to see renewable projects truly benefit their local area directly. Both of these link to the debate over the fair distribution of benefit. To maintain public support for ambitious targets, the benefits of the renewables revolution must be distributed in a fair and transparent way, not just to the large companies, although they of course have their role to play, but to the public, to the cooperative sector and to the community sector too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Jim Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Along with other members who have spoken in this debate, I too welcome the Committee's inquiry and its conclusion that Scotland's renewable energy targets can be met. I think this was put rather well in evidence to the Committee by Graham Blackett of Bigger Economics, who said the short answer is that they are achievable. I'm not suggesting that they will be met by onshore wind alone, but taking into account what has already been installed, what is being constructed and what is going through the planning system, I think that and our current hydro capacity will get us pretty close to the 100% target, and that is before we consider the offshore sector. So why is it so important that we achieve our renewables ambition and that we get there by 2020? It is about more than simply delivering energy security, and it is about more than providing protection from volatile gas prices, mindful that the gas price largely drives the electricity price. It also means a major reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, as agreed by this Parliament. In fact, a Cambridge econometric study into the economics of gas and offshore wind, published on behalf of Greenpeace and WWF in November last year, clearly showed that deployment of wind could reduce carbon emissions by 2/3 across the UK. But one of the biggest prizes in achieving our renewable energy targets will be the re-industrialisation of Scotland, a process that will see the creation of highly skilled and high-technology jobs for Scotland's future workforce, including jobs in civil engineering, wind farm development, turbine production, 3D modelling and many more besides. And over the next 4 years, Scotland aims to deliver 2,000 modern apprenticeships specifically for the industries involved in renewable energy and climate change, and have created a pilot apprenticeship framework in wind turbine manufacture at Carnegie College, referred to earlier by Margaret McDougall. Now, according to industry itself in its route map, published by the Offshore Wind Industry Group in January of this year, securing 1/3 of the UK offshore wind market would secure an estimated gross value added in Scotland of £7 billion and create over 28,000 jobs. Over the last 3 years, the Scottish Government has offered considerable encouragement to the industry, but it has done more than that. It has taken the necessary steps to deliver confidence, demand and certainty. Those steps have paid off. The reality now, today, is that in the last year, applications were submitted for more than 4,000 megawatts of new offshore generation. And to put that in context, it represents the capacity of almost half of the generating plant in operation in Scotland today. It is a greater amount of generation capacity than has ever been in planning at any given time in Scotland, and more is yet to come. The formation of East Coast Renewables, an alliance of 10 local authorities, all working together to achieve Scotland's renewables target, and the involvement of organisations and companies from Aberdeen, referred to by my colleague Mr Stewart, to East Lothian, represented by Ian Gray, is a hugely positive development. And now that industry has submitted its applications and its environmental assessments, they have provided a picture of what the economic opportunity will look like. It will be a new sector, one which is located within a 200-mile radius on Scotland's east coast. It will require the construction and fabrication of upwards of 900 offshore substructures, each of them up to 300 feet high and made of either steel or concrete. On top of those will sit a similar number of turbines, their associated blades, gearboxes and control systems. All of these turbines will need to be connected to scores of new technology, new high-voltage current offshore substation platforms. This will be done with hundreds of miles of subsea cabling, which will eventually take the power to shore. To install this, we will need dedicated installation vessels and the deployment, the development and specialisation of deep water installation techniques. And to operate and maintain all of this, we will need new and dedicated onshore facilities for a new and permanent workforce. Alison Johnson talked about the renewables revolution. Presiding Officer, Scotland has not had a better opportunity within this generation to achieve economic prosperity, and the prize is the reindustrialisation of Scotland, the reinvigoration of our manufacturing base and the rediscovery of world leadership in heavy engineering.
We now turn to closing speeches. Can I remind all members who participated in this debate that they should be in the chamber for closing speeches? And I call on Alex Johnson. 6 minutes, Mr Johnson.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am interested to note the way in which Murdo Fraser introduced this debate to Parliament today. I thought he was very statesmanlike, and the thought occurred that had he been sitting where I'm sitting, it may have been a very different speech. Nevertheless, the duty falls to me to attempt at least to make the speech that Murdo might have chosen to give. This has been an excellent debate, and it has brought out a lot that's been positive, and there are one or two people I would like to praise for that as I go through. It has, unfortunately, also brought out one or two things that were eminently predictable, and I may mention a few names when we get to that stage as well. But the first thing that was mentioned by the Minister, and it's been repeated several times, is that, yes, Scotland can achieve 100% of its required electricity generation capacity by 2020. Whether that's desirable or whether we are going to show adequate concern for the victims of that policy remains to be seen. And that's what I want to talk about. One of the key issues that was raised early in the debate, and we've touched on several times, is planning. Now, planning has been the bane of the renewable industry since the start, particularly when it comes to onshore wind turbines. And it is a problem that we have never adequately solved. And as we get to the phase where significant numbers of turbines are being erected day on day, I can now drive across the North East quite rarely and not spot a turbine that wasn't there the last time I passed that way. We are now in a position where people are beginning to see the effects of these turbines. Cumulative visual impact is something which will be of concern to many, many people. And having spoken to some of the people in the Angus Glens, for example, who are concerned that their proximity to Perthshire means that turbines are being erected with, it would seem, little reference to what's happening on either side of that boundary, then I can only share their concern. At the end, I want to deal with a specific point at this stage. Mary Scanlon, at the end of her speech, was trying to raise the issue of buffer zones and unfortunately didn't have the chance. So I'd like to draw everybody's attention to paragraph 74 of the report, where it says most authorities are applying Scottish planning policy in relation to the 2-kilometre separation appropriately. However, there seems to be a difference between the separation of turbines from settlements, but not from the individuals or groups of houses in remote areas. So someone living in Inverness, for example, will know that no large turbines can be built within 2 kilometres of the city. But if they live in a more sparsely populated area, they could have turbines within less than a kilometre from their home. It is a concern of many people in rural areas that turbines are being approved in areas where they impose themselves on the individuals who live in sparsely populated communities. On you go then.
Stuart Stevenson, I take it you're referring to Mr Johnson rather than Mr Gibson. Stuart Stevenson.
Is the member aware that the SNP's offer at the last council elections in the Shire was to look at harmonising the distance with adjacent authorities from Aberdeenshire? It remains at 400 metres in Aberdeenshire, where the Tories lead that council and are yet to look at reviewing the separation distances.
Alec Johnson.
I am fully aware that the SNP are capable of saying one thing in Aberdeenshire and another thing in Edinburgh, and there's nothing new there. I would, however, like to move on to one or two of the other issues that have been raised. I would like to talk about the issue of fuel poverty. Now, it's been mentioned by several people here today that our pursuit of the renewable target will drive up the cost of electricity. Now, it seems simple arithmetic to me that if you have a system that's using renewable obligation certificates and feed-in tariffs to encourage and underpin an industry, and that if these additional subsidies are paid for by the consumer, that the consumer themselves will suffer as a result. If we achieve our objective, then what we're doing is forcing up the price of electricity. Now, when we look at I'm very much running out of time. As we look at energy policy across the board, we have always argued that it is necessary to have a balanced energy policy. While we have joined this government in criticising the previous Labour government for the failure to show adequate vision in energy policy, the SNP themselves, in opposition and in government, have shown, some would describe as an irrational distaste for nuclear energy, and we've seen that again today from a number of speakers. And the reason why I call it irrational is that we hear people like Roddy Campbell praising Germany for the fact that they're going to close their nuclear power stations by sometime in the middle of the next decade, and not mentioning the fact in any way that they are in fact building 12 new coal-fired power stations to achieve that. If only we had our old friend Christopher Harvey with us here today to tell us how they do things in Germany, he may have had a bit to say about the old East German brown coal industry that might have informed us. Yes, there is much that's been discussed in this debate today which will require a lot of attention. But even the Minister himself made it quite clear that most of the things that we need to deal with will have to be dealt with on an international or at least on a UK-wide basis. I think, once again, Fergus Ewan has given the opportunity for us to ask for Scotland's two governments to work together in harmony to achieve this objective without the damaging consequences that this policy and independence could bring.
Thank you. And now calling Ken Macintosh, and I can give you up to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I think both the committee's report and this afternoon's debate has revealed a tentative consensus. I think Mary Scanlon said accurately she welcomed the tone of the debate so far. Yes. And also, I think Marco Biaggi also said perhaps consensus was too strong a word, but a common position, which I think is right. And then went on to dwell on the divisions, which I hope I won't do too much. But I think that the report does reveal certainly a shared agreement about the direction of travel, but perhaps a surprising level of disagreement about how to get there or the scale of the obstacles in the way. If I just start with the issue of planning, because clearly there is general support across Scotland for onshore wind. But the committee accurately identified the concern amongst some, in fact not many, local communities of being overwhelmed by development. Now, it would be unfortunate indeed if in our genuine desire to promote renewables and tackle carbon emissions, we were to create an incentive to small landowners to overpopulate the countryside with single or small numbers of highly visible but environmentally unhelpful wind turbines. And Murdo Fraser, on behalf of the committee, highlighted the need for spatial plans to be developed in every area of Scotland. But I thought Ian Gray went on accurately, in fact in an excellent contribution generally, to flag up the problems created when democratically accountable local authorities rejected applications for wind farms, only to find those decisions repeatedly overturned by the Scottish Government. And as he concluded, the net effect of central government seeming to approve every application, no matter the circumstance, is to undermine confidence in the system and to provoke greater resistance to wind farms generally. I think Mr Gibson first.
Rob Gibson.
If two neighbouring farmers were to apply for a turbine on their farm that was less than 2 kilometres from each other, you would say that one of them shouldn't get it. and indeed that if there's 76% of farmers find it difficult in planning to get these, do you think we're making the best use of that natural resource by such a restriction in the countryside?
Ken McIntosh.
Well, I think that what Mr Gibson points out, that these are not easy decisions, but surely I would trust the local authorities to work in harmony with developers and with the Scottish Government, and instead of working against each other. And I think for the Scottish Government to come in heavy-handed and pretend that they know better than local communities does not do our shared objectives any good whatsoever. And as I say, I don't think we want to see... There's a room for planned development in Scotland, but overdevelopment is not something that any of us wish to see out of thought. Now, Presiding Officer, Parliament has united in the past, and the committee did so again, on the need to ensure a fairer system of transmission charges to and from our islands. And Liam MacArthur and a number of members today pointed out that the development not just of onshore wind farms on our islands, but of offshore wind and potential future wave and tidal energy depends on establishing island connections to the grid with sufficient capacity to cope. The charging regime has yet to be finally agreed by Ofgem and industry, and our message today to make sure the Scottish Islands are not disadvantaged is a clear one. And I welcomed the Minister's remarks here. He said he was keen to work consensually to resolve this problem, and I would welcome that. One slight concern I will raise, though, on this issue followed the publication this week of the Scottish Government's supplementary response to its consultation on the Renewables Obligation Banding Review. As the committee itself has recommended, if the transmission charging regime cannot be amended, there is still a duty on all parties, including the Scottish Government, to find a remedy to this problem of transmission charges. The ROC system could have proved part of that remedy, but this week's paper failed to address the issue at all. And in fact, sticking to that paper, there was a number of the government's conclusions on ROCs which left me worried, particularly on the issue of biomass. I welcomed Alison Johnson's comments on the role of heat, but like my colleague Rhoda Grant, I was slightly unsure where the committee was heading in its conclusions on renewable heat. I thought that the Minister agreed with Labour and many others that there is a role for small-scale biomass and potentially for good quality combined heat and power generators. But his announcement this week gives the green light to develop plant operating at 35% efficiency, despite the European recommendation of a 70% efficiency rate. And in the past, the Minister's excuse has been to highlight a 10 megawatt cap on the power-only plants, but he now appears also to have raised that by 50%. And I would certainly hope that the EEG committee will give this matter further consideration when the regulations come before them. Now, several members raised the importance of securing community benefit. And in fact, I thought there was an excellent section in the committee report on this. And as Rhoda Grant highlighted, the Scottish Government could do more to promote community ownership, not just benefit, but community ownership, tackling the costs and the red tape that get in the way. But perhaps the most important issue raised in the committee's report is the skills shortage. Witnesses to the committee were unanimous in flagging up the seriousness of the problem, with several stating quite clearly that we will not make the renewable targets without an appropriately skilled workforce. And evidence the committee identified some of the problems standing in the way of building this workforce as competition from other industries and the failure of workers to transfer over from oil and gas. And the committee went on particularly to talk about how we might promote STEM subjects at an earlier age, challenging the gender segregation that still puts off so many young women from a career in engineering. And I have to say, I agreed with Margaret McDougall when she was saying that the Scottish Government's own actions in clearly favouring higher education over further education, of funding universities but not colleges, sends out a pretty negative message. And I think all the work we did over the first 8 years of this Parliament to break down the academic vocational divide and to build the knowledge economy is undone with that decision to cut college funding. Presiding Officer, I did really have to laugh, or at least a wry smile. I wasn't laughing at this report, but a wry smile when I read the committee's conclusions on electricity market reform. It's not that I disagree with the concerns raised about the complexity of introducing the new contracts for difference and the potential destabilising effect this might have on securing investment in renewables. It was the contrast between the report's constant references to the damaging effects of uncertainty created by EMR, followed a mere matter of paragraphs later by the admittedly dissented conclusion that apparently there is no such uncertainty over the impact of the referendum. And my colleague Ian Gray clearly also saw the same unintended ironic contrast when the committee is so willing to flag up the uncertainty of EMR but to reject all other uncertainties or risks, despite having much evidence to do so. Presiding Officer, I wanted to just briefly mention the fact that
I really don't have much
but
time
I don't
left.
have enough time. So what I would suggest, Presiding Officer, I can to the Minister, that the words are fine, and if words were all it takes, we'd all be there already, but is actions what we need, and I'd like to support the Scottish Government if it actually follows through this with actions that overcome these obstacles.
Thank you. And now call in Fergus Ewing, maximum 8 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I think it's been an extremely useful and very wide-ranging debate this afternoon, and I wanted to try to do justice to reply to some of the requests for responses from individual members, starting with Rhoda Grant. And Rhoda Grant asked about what progress has been made in the Intergovernmental Charging Group. A consultant has been appointed by agreement between Davy and myself and the other members of the group, and evidence-gathering sessions have taken place in the Western Isles on 13th of February, are due to take place in Shetland on the 27th and 28th of February, and Orkney on the 28th of February and the 1st of March. Thereafter, my request to John Hayes, which was relayed at a meeting with him last week, is that because of the huge importance of this, that there should be a ministerial attendance at the governmental group. Now, Liam MacArthur in his contribution did suggest some possible solutions, and of course there are several possible solutions. One is an island rock, which could be X plus Y, where X is the evidence-based island rock and Y is the cost of transmission. That would buffet and ensure the return for investor. Of course, that only takes us up to 2017, so there may need to be a CFD solution as well. That probably will be the case. And thirdly, these solutions could be combined with others, but also with the Section 185 order, which would put a cap on the existing charges. I think it must be said, though, that we are in this place because the UK regulator Ofgem did not provide a solution for the whole of the UK. Indeed, the islands have been separated from a solution which the mainland has been offered. That is a very, very serious state of affairs, and it's one where there must be a solution. So I will continue to work positively and constructively with the UK Government, with the colleagues in the Labour, Liberal Democrat, Conservative and Green parties in this Parliament to find a solution. I will do my best to keep members informed about the progress of this extremely important issue to the best of my ability, and the matter will be raised at the Convention of the Highlands and Islands, which is due to take place, I think, in Lerwick next month, and which I will certainly attend, and we will keep the members fully advised about this. Now, I thought Alison Johnson made an excellent contribution covering many topics which others perhaps didn't do so. And I just wanted to say that in relation to district heating, we've had an expert commission, some of the meetings of which I've chaired, because I'm personally committed to taking forward district heating. She rightly praised the success in Aberdeen. There's been success in Shetland as well. There's been other success in Glasgow. What's at stake here is tackling fuel poverty in a really effective way. And one lady, a tenant in Glasgow, in a flat in Glasgow, in a tower block in Glasgow, which has had the benefit of a district heating scheme, put it very simply. She said, this scheme has meant that I don't have to wear my duffel coat indoors anymore. I think that puts it as well as it can be put. I'll take Rob Gibson.
Rob Gibson.
Well, the Minister welcomed the Ignis scheme in Wick, where 200 people are now getting heat, and the distillery is getting steam in the town, and indeed this can be expanded as another district heating system. That's a great success.
Minister.
I was aware of that. I think I've been invited to visit it, which I hope very much to do, and if I do, I will most certainly combine that with a further visit to the old Pulteney distillery, whose best product, I may say, is not steam. Community renewables have been touched on by many members, and I wanted to say that prior to the end of this financial year, I'm advised that we expect funding for 6 community projects to be approved, 5 of which are through the CARES pre-planning pipeline, and this will result in around £2 million spent in the community renewable sector. I was pleased that so many members, Mary Scanlon, Alison Johnson, Stuart McMillan, of course Rob Gibson highlights these matters. as do really many members. And we want to do far more in community renewables, but we recognise the mechanics are extremely challenging and difficult. There's no doubt about that at all. And our job through Community Energy Scotland and through the CARE scheme and through some excellent civil servants who are fully committed to making this successful is to spread out the benefits to as many communities as possible. And I'm very keen to work with members of all parties in these matters. Now, Margaret McDougall, I think, mentioned skills at some length, and quite rightly so. And Ken McIntosh mentioned that this is a particular challenge. I agree. Of course it's a challenge. It's a challenge for the whole world. We're short of engineers. The whole world is short of engineers. When I visited Calgary, when the First Minister visited Norway, these are challenges that are faced by all nations, not simply in renewable energy, but oil and gas and across the spectrum. And part of the answer, of course, is for more emphasis on STEM topics. The Scottish Government, I'm pleased to say, has provided funding for nearly £2 million for this academic year to allow the Funding Council to support an additional 300 funded university places in STEM, increasing this to 1,200. Of the 25,000 modern apprenticeships, we've ring-fenced 500 starts for energy during each year in this Parliament. And engineering and energy-related modern apprenticeship starts show a 13% increase over the past 2 years. That is welcome, but we need to do more. We recognise that. There's no point in backslapping, congratulating ourselves on what's been achieved. That's no use as a minister. You've always got to look to tomorrow and do better, and that's what we are determined to do. So I'm grateful that this has emerged very clearly as a topic that all members have said. I would also recognise the work that SSE and Scottish Power have done in setting up and supporting apprenticeships and work in places like Carnegie, in Inverness, in Ayr, in Dumfries. And that also means that throughout these parts of Scotland, where rightly there are many people who are antagonistic towards aspects of the renewable energy policy, at least they can see that somebody, a son of somebody they know, is getting an apprenticeship, is getting a job in these areas. That's immensely important, Presiding Officer. Nuclear has been touched upon. And I think I should clarify, I think Ian Gray, with respect, does know this, that I have visited Torness. I've paid tribute to the professionalism of the work there. We are not opposed to continuing existing nuclear power stations in use where they can safely do so. I recognise the professionalism of the operation there and in Hunterston, whose life extension we supported. What we do not believe is it's sensible to build new nuclear power stations when the costs of the ones that are being built in France and Finland have exceeded their estimates by 2- or 3-fold, and also, Presiding Officer, where the Public Accounts Committee of Westminster has estimated that the decommissioning costs of Sellafield alone amount to £67.5 billion. Now, that's a Westminster committee. That strikes me as game over for new nuclear power stations, quite frankly, if the decision...
The Minister's just concluding.
Well, I'm very sorry. I'm happy to continue, as always, our discourse later.
If you could please come to the conclusion, Minister.
I think the committee report is a very solid piece of work. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, it will not be easy to achieve the targets, but I believe that Scotland, in setting these targets, has created an interest and investment, jobs and businesses in Scotland, here and now and tomorrow, which will be good for all of us and good for a proper energy policy.
Thank you very much. I now call on Trick Brodie to wind up the debate on behalf of the committee. You have until 5 o'clock, Mr Brodie.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome the almost consensuality of the debate today. The committee's inquiry was to explore whether the government's targets for renewable energy were achievable, and I think the report has proven that to be the case. And before I start on the meat of my delivery, I'd like to offer my thanks also to past and present members of the committee, to the convener who was not poor, to the 87 oral witnesses who gave evidence, the 183 items of written submissions, 21 items of supplementary evidence, visits to Orkney, Caithness, Perth and Fife, and a report that took 11 months to prepare. It was more like war and peace. We did have a few skirmishes, but I believe, in general, the whole thing was a constructive team effort. The debate, I believe, Presiding Officer, has added constructively, as I said, to the report. and the committee also welcomes, in support of that, the government's renewable route map for renewable energy and the Good Practice Wind project, which guide has now been published. And these too will add to the report's finding, as will the briefings received from so many professionals in the industry. And while, Presiding Officer, a significant proportion of the committee's time was spent on onshore wind, maybe disproportionately, the significance of a balanced energy supply from various sources was recognised, as was the need to how best reduce energy demand domestically and in transport, and yet secure our low-carbon emission targets. The general summation, after full consideration, is that Scotland will achieve its renewable targets for electricity and heat, but will hopefully accept the recommendations, the positive recommendations contained in the report, and I believe the Government has recognised that in its positive response to the report. Many members have talked about planning, and I'd just like to briefly touch on some of these, because this is a key element in the achievement of the targets. And how do we actually ease the planning process and the guidelines provided by planning authorities? The increased number of planning applications, largely but not wholly, are born out of the past subsidy regime suggested in favour of single turbine applications. And hydro and small biomass applications will, in time add to that. So why we welcome the recent financial measures on funding and fees taken and proposed by the Government to address the resource obstacles. But we need to understand, through regular reporting by local authorities, as to where we are in terms of scoping, planning and approvals. To further advance that efficiency, the committee felt that if increased fees for larger scale, as the convener said, for larger scale planning applications were applied, it was not unreasonable then to expect planning authorities to improve their efficiency by taking on the job of collecting and gathering data on cumulative and environmental impacts at the centre. That, I believe, will help take some wind and heat out of the local disputes that we have. And while a range of studies demonstrate that the majority of Scots are indeed supportive of the development of onshore and offshore wind, we recognise there has to be a much greater involvement of communities, of investment by communities, of communication with communities, so that we get a balanced view on planning approvals. Guidelines, understanding and practice in and between and across planning authorities and bodies like Scottish National Heritage needs to be better established and applied. Presiding Officer, as Margaret McDougall and Ken McIntosh mentioned, a major gating factor to the achievement of our targets is the availability and take-up of requisite skills, and as the Minister mentioned, particularly in STEM subjects. The interchangeability and the competitiveness of skill requirements between the renewables industry and the still burgeoning oil and gas industry provides a challenge to be met. I am encouraged that the engagement between the Scottish Government, the Scottish Funding Council and the Energy and Skills Partnership is critical to overcome this and is welcome. However, the demographic demand requires much greater involvement of teachers, of parents, actually taking them out to the industry and showing them that engineering, for example, is not a dirty industry. Scotland is leading the way on technology through EMEC and EOWDC, and it can establish a skilled workforce that gives the country global reach in this industry. In the case of finance, Presiding Officer, mentioned briefly, certainly by Mary Scanlon and Marco Biaggi, the committee recognised that the relevant technologies are developed, and with them is the potential, with the higher proportion of tidal, offshore wave power potential, Scotland could secure up to £46 billion of investment and nearly 40,000 jobs in this industry by 2020. There are, however, some uncertainties, as was said, and the greatest financial challenge that we face is the uncertainty created by DEC and Westminster in terms of the lack of clarity on ROCs through 2014 and the currently apparently rudderless passage of EMR and an unsure energy bill at Westminster. We have had, just this week, the indication that the government, despite the coalition's agreement that there would be no subsidy for nuclear, now talking about 40-year subsidies for new nuclear stations. That is absolutely disgraceful, and it certainly is something that will be fought rigorously. In declaring that uncertainty, Presiding Officer, the committee found there was no significant evidence that there was an uncertainty in the current constitutional debate. And I take Rhoda Grant's point, but I think the Minister handled that and answered that in the way in which he indicated that they are trying to have meaningful conversations with the government at Westminster. So this has been a good debate. 10 minutes, 8 minutes is not enough time to do justice to the time and effort of the witnesses, the clerks, and the committee members itself. The summation of the report, though, is this. In the face of uncertainty, certainly created by the situation in Westminster on EMR and the energy bill, I believe that with greater development of decentralised generation, demand reduction, storage, better and fairer interconnections, with the involvement and the awareness of individuals, the involvement of communities, the involvement of local authorities, suppliers, developers and investors, we can and we will achieve our renewable electricity and heat and low-carbon emission targets. The report, Presiding Officer, I hope, seriously contributed to the debate and to securing the energy future of Scotland.
That concludes the debate on the Economy, Energy and Tourism on its report on the achievability of the Scottish Government's renewable energy targets. We now move to the next item of business, and the next item of business is consideration of motion number 5672 in the name of Liam MacArthur on behalf of the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body on the nomination of a pension fund trustee for the Scottish Parliamentary Contributory-Pension-Fund. I call on Liam MacArthur to move the motion.
I move the motion.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time. There are two questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion number 5596 in the name of Murdo Fraser on the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee's report on the achievability of the Scottish Government's renewable energy targets be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5672 in the name of Liam MacArthur on the Scottish Parliamentary Contributory Pension Fund be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. I now close this meeting.